Welcome back, everybody. I'd like to introduce Chris Neugebauer. He's a PSF Fellow, Director of LinuxConf EU 2017, and a convener for a bunch of PyCon AUs over the last years. He enjoys presenting open source at mobile conferences and mobile at open source conferences. And today he's going to talk about how to decide between continuity and change in open source communities.
Thank you, Marcus. I really should put it on my rider for future talks so I get somebody German to introduce me. It really does improve getting my name pronounced correctly, which is great. Yeah, I am Chris. You can find my contact details, including my Twitter handle, if you wish to heckle me somewhere on that slide. You can look at it and try and spot it. It's there somewhere. I'm a guy from that city in that picture, though that was like 4 years ago now. So yeah, I'm this guy. I have become known in the community here as somewhat of a serial conference organizer. I was responsible for the 2012 and 2013 editions of PyCon Australia and have been sort of the bane of organizers' existences at PyCon AU ever since. I was elected as a fellow of the Python Software Foundation in 2013, and I'm currently director of LinuxConf AU 2017, which is running in January in Hobart, and you should totally, well, I can't tell you to submit a paper right now, but there will be ticket sales in a month or so. So running conferences has meant that I haven't really had a whole lot of time to write code or contribute to open source code projects over the last few years. So this year I took the clever step of basically merging the two activities together and starting on an open source project for maintaining the conferences that I run. This is the first time I've sort of been the primary public developer or primary core developer on an open source code project. The conferences I've run are volunteer activities of similar scales. This project I'm working on, registration, has mostly been enabled by grants from the Python Software Foundation, who I would like to publicly thank for actually keeping me afloat for the last year or so. So community-run conferences tend to exhibit most of the difficulties that happen around open source code projects, but many of the difficulties that you see in them are amplified in the extreme. There are deadlines that you have, and the deadlines, rather than just upsetting people, have actual financial penalties attached to them. But rather than business activities where there are financial penalties, most of the staff are volunteers, and most of the people who come to participate in conferences are people who want to scratch their own itches in some way, shape or form. So over the last 10 years, there have been enough people within LinuxConf AU who have decided that writing conference management software was an itch worth scratching in terms of running events. This resulted in a project called Zookeeper, which is on the surface not too bad, though you may take what I say in some of the coming slides as a bit of a coded critique, if you like. There are people in this room who are giggling when I said that, just to give you an idea. Yeah, coded. So I mentioned that volunteer conferences capture a lot of the difficulties of open source projects generally, but amplified. So open source projects experience a phenomenon called the drive-through contributor. You may see this in the literature as drive-by. I do not use that term. Basically, drive-through contributors are contributors who show up, have a short interaction with the project, and then leave. Conference organizers who use conference management software like drive-throughs in the extreme. They use the project, they have an engagement that fulfills their own event's needs, and then they disappear. If you want to see more stuff about drive-through contributors, you should see Vicky's talk from 40 minutes ago. Scheduling. So likewise, the maintainability of software becomes less of a relevant issue for people running events as deadlines approach. That is because as you get closer to actually needing to put a thing on, there is less time available to spend on code review as deadlines are approaching and eyeballs start hitting the site. And most people who are doing these things can justify not actually applying genuine software engineering rigorous practices to maintaining their site because there is a fixed deadline, and at the end of that fixed deadline, there is no future need for maintenance. Once a conference has been, doing maintenance on that year's conference website stops being a thing you really need to do. This has manifested itself in Zookeeper by there being a fork for every year of LinuxConf AU since 2010. And these various forks have varying levels of mergedness into mainline, which is a problem in and of itself. So if you imagine sort of running an event like an agile sprint, the earlier time frame in organization has available to you the whole pile of features that you might want to have added to something and equal amounts of being able to achieve something, and people will go and pick up the things that they want to pick up the most. And the later you get into that process, there's still a bunch of stuff that needs doing. That stuff tends to be less easy. It tends to be less desirable to write, and there's also a lot less time to actually go and get that stuff done. And what this means is that the problems that emerge very, very late in planning tend not to get fixed, even if these exact same problems manifest themselves in the exact same way with the exact same fixes every single year. So this year I've been adopting a different approach with the 2017 team. We're using a different existing management package and writing the code that we need to bring that software up to parity with what we've expected from Zookeeper. And this essentially has found me writing the ticket sales aspect of this package and trying to solve some of the mistakes that Zookeeper made over these years. But I've been involved in PyCon AU now for, this is my 5th year, and I've failed to make the case for this change since about 2014. I failed to make that case for change this year. We used Zookeeper to run the 2016 site, even though I promised functional working code in time for the conference to run. I wasn't able to bring the community over. And so a lot of the rest of this talk is what I've learned in 5 years of failing to get people to act in a different way. So I'd like to talk about how we successfully affected this project, but right now it's not complete. I can't really talk about how it went. It seems to be going okay for now, I guess. What I can talk about is the thoughts that I went through in terms of making this project happen and actually getting it off the ground. So we're going to take a bit of a philosophical look into how we bring community projects to change the software that underpins it. So justification of change or continuity generally comes down to the idea of cost-benefit analysis. You know, it's where you weigh up what it will take to make a change and what benefits that change will bring about. When you are a for-profit operation, a cost-benefit analysis asks one question: will the time and money that is saved in the future exceed the amount of time and money it takes that you need to spend in order to affect that change? A secondary question here might be when this change will happen. Costs that are saved 10 years into the future might not be worth an extended amount of pain right now. The point that I'm trying to make though here is that when you have money and are trying to employ people, you have tangible metrics. You can measure something, you can say whether or not what you are doing is working. Volunteer projects, though, are generally not driven by money. Indeed, where possible, spending more time to reduce burnout, make people more familiar with stuff, make people happier when they are doing things, with no monetary award attached to that, can be a good thing that is worth doing. People are on open source projects because they want to feel belonging, they want to feel ownership of what they achieve. They generally want to feel like they're doing good work. Burning out volunteers is a thing that happens, but it's hard to measure this. And indeed, the actual act of measuring whether or not you are burning out volunteers might be something that your project does not have capacity to do and will hence cause burnout itself. Volunteers' time is a limited thing. So projects don't tend to sail smoothly from start to finish. They're living, breathing things. They last through multiple years. Volunteers can come and go. People's directions can change. Projects make mistakes, they develop technical debt, projects can become obsolete. So continuity is what happens when the benefits of changes are severely outweighed by the costs to your community. I don't have a whole lot to say about continuity, other than sometimes it is a thing that happens, and for the most part, if you can justify it, that is completely fine. Well-considered change can actually look like continuity to the casual observer. If so, it's really quite easy to justify, because even if you change things substantially, you don't impact the remainder of what the community sees. A couple of Python examples, for example, Django channels. In this, Andrew Godwin went and entirely rewrote Django's event handling infrastructure, but kept the request response API exactly the same. Most of the community would not be affected if channels suddenly became a compulsory part of Django. Python 3 is also an example of this, though it took us until version 3.3 of Python to come out before we realized this was the case. We thought it was a wholesale change until we realized that it wasn't. So the harder type of change to justify is the wholesale replacement of something that was previously important with something else. This is harder to justify because it immediately involves people who aren't, because it intimately, involves people who aren't you with the unknown. It means that if you go and develop on the old thing that is pending end of life, you might be wasting effort, and that might not be all that encouraging to you. Going on developing on the new speculative thing might not pay off in the future, and that might be a waste of your time. I'm going to spend the remainder of this talk considering how to handle wholesale change. A few examples of wholesale change in open source. Who here remembers turbo gears as a thing? And who here actually uses it? Basically, a few years ago, the project leads of both Turbo Gears and Pyramid realized that they were trying to do the same thing with basically the same suite of Python projects. They were web frameworks that sort of select a best of breed of smaller libraries. And they realized they were doing basically the same thing. They merged the projects, and that resulted in most of the Turbo Gears developers disappearing, and disappearing very, very quickly. So that led to a community disappearing. In the world of C, in the late 1990s, GCC completely forked, and that fork eventually became the official version of GCC. And of course, Python 3. Before we realized there was a common subset, we spent a lot of effort as a community trying to convince people to move over to what was an entirely different programming language. And this was seen as a wholesale change for the vast majority of Python developers, even if it is not these days. So with change comes risk. Open source projects, they're run mostly by volunteers, have a few that you need to consider specifically. Bike shedding is when you have endless arguments over relatively minor details of a large proposal rather than substantive engagement in big issues. Bike shedding is really, really common in volunteer projects because commenting on small things takes a very small time commitment. But if you want to make comments on large-scale things, you need to make an equivalent time commitment in order to understand the rationale and the effects of a larger-scale change. Bike shedding is a waste of time, and it generally leads to key architectural decisions not getting the scrutiny they deserve. And this is often because volume of comment is mistaken for rigor. Bike shedding should be considered inevitable. But reduction of it at inopportune moments is key. Focusing on code over planning meetings is a really good way to do this. Have working code that people can comment on rather than giant proposals. Open source projects uniquely are susceptible to forking. And forking is not just going and clicking a button on GitHub, it's when an entire community breaks apart because some members want to focus on one priority where other members want to focus on something different, and these things are diametrically opposed. And whilst it's something that you don't need to avoid at all costs, losing volunteers on your efforts can hurt. So consider why you want to maintain all of your volunteers and what you can do to keep them on board and what needs of theirs you can meet. That said, don't try and force people to keep working on old code that they don't want to work on. If they want to do that, and not work on your things, then it's probably not worth your while to force them, because they'll probably disappear anyway. And in the process, it can also reduce morale across the entirety of your team. So after you've decided that change is necessary, you need to consider how to make people in your community want to make the same changes as you do. So the more central the thing that you're trying to change in your project, the greater the amount of the project and the people involved that you're going to affect. Generally, if something exists in your project, somebody owns it. There might be a user whose ability to work is affected if it stops being there. Give fair consideration to whose needs are more important. Focusing on the needs of current developers will often help you maintain momentum with your current contributor base, but focusing on the needs of end users can lead to growing your user and your contributor base. If you're having difficulty attracting new contributors, focusing on the needs of your existing developer team might not be the right idea. In LCA's case, even though our change is motivated by fixing issues with end user usability, we made the decision to adopt a base platform with a significant existing developer community. And this increased the support base for our developers, because we can go and ask people who aren't involved with the conference for help rather than overburdening our own people. Start by speaking to the people who you know will most benefit. Getting support is a really good idea before going and taking changes to people who might offer resistance. Offer a clear pathway to achieving the changes that you want. Figure out what your end goal is. Are there intermediate steps that you can take where you'll need help? Can you evaluate whether what you're doing is worthwhile and likely to succeed before you go and make the effort to convert the entire community? In our case, we set deadlines and agreed on deadlines for evaluating the functionality of new software before we undertook any development work, so we knew when we could abort the project of changing over our software. We knew when things would need to appear viable before we could commit to it. So once you've advocated for the need for change, you need to figure out how to affect it. In general, a community will not accept complete immediate change by dictum, with very, very, very few exceptions. Because people in an open source project are volunteers. And they won't decide to do something just because their project lead tells them to do it. Stuff in open source tends to happen because people are there because they have itches to scratch. Deciding that you, as a project lead, are going to do a whole pile of work does not mean that everybody else in your project is going to have the same vision, especially if there is no clear immediate benefit to those contributors. So if you're in a community that centers around code, being able to say, this is what we can do is generally a better thing to say than, wouldn't it be good if we could do this thing? This comes down to giving your volunteers a really clear pathway towards the end goal at all times, making it obvious that progress is being made towards solving the problems that they may have had, and making it clear that their problems might be being solved. In general, working code will always prevent bike shedding. Very, very reliably so. It doesn't always make sense to involve every single stakeholder in a project. There'll be people in a project who believe that what they're doing is fine, that the status quo is fine for them. These are the sorts of people who do not have much incentive to change and will often offer resistance. Instead, find the people who have difficulty with the status quo or are being let down with the current direction of your project, because these are the sorts of people who you can most obviously help. Volunteers tend to be in your community because they want to work with you, so try and enable them to do things. And getting engagement out of a community tends to work best when you have a proposal for people to hack on and improve. So go and involve people once you have something that they can work on. but never exclude people permanently. Involving the right people at the right time means that you can have greater control over the sorts of resistance that you have to a project's change. Having a working prototype or mostly finished product means you can change the decision from should we start this work to should we adopt this change? And the second question is a much easier one for a community to assess. Sometimes the energy required to get a project up and running can exceed what you as a volunteer have to do in a weekend or a couple of weekends. There are a couple of organisations out there who can offer grants for doing significant open source work or can help you raise the funds in order to achieve an initial working project. My conference management work has been funded by the Python Software Foundation. They offer grants for people doing open source software development. I've seen programs from other various foundations also used to similar effect. I've also seen Kickstarter and Patreon used to reasonable effect to kick off or maintain project success. Once you go off and do the things you expect to do, involve people throughout the progress. Make sure you're doing the right thing and that you bring the community with you. Keep people's expectations managed. My grant work with the PSF has meant that I needed to give regular status updates, but I've also involved other potential contributors and LCA team members throughout this process. They know where things are at as I develop things. And sometimes your attempts will not work, and that's okay. Just make sure that if you are going to fail, you're failing for the right reasons, that your ideas were flawed or that there are better solutions to the problems that you're trying to solve, and not because you've gone and dealt with your community in the wrong way. And that is the end of my slides. I have time for questions, comments, bike shedding, things like that.
Thanks, Chris. We got a couple of minutes, about 10 minutes for questions.
What's bike shedding?
I invite you to go and watch the video at some point. It is when people waste time discussing pointless things. But I did have a whole slide on it. You can review the slides in my notes later on.
You're doing some work on an open source project for an open source community. I've had a similar problem where I have some code that I've written for a sporting community, and I think it would be great to have people helping me out in doing that because I've obviously got an opinion on it. How do you think it can be, how can you attract people to your problem when they're not necessarily all developers? So most of the people who will benefit from my software aren't actually developers. How do I go about building a community around that?
So I'm assuming that the sorts of people you're dealing with are users of the software that you have developed. Ask them what they think of it, where they are having difficulties with it. Have links for feedback and ask questions. Sit down with people and see if they're having difficulty with things or if there are things that they want. You have a whole series of stakeholders in your community regardless of whether or not they're developers. In the case of open source communities, we have a significant number of members of our communities who are developers, but generally the people who are not developers will exist in every sort of community whether they are developer focused or not. So treat them as valuable stakeholders, talk to them, see what their difficulties are, and see if you can help meet their needs.
Chris, thanks for the talk. What parallels and differences do you see with this kind of skill set for working within an organisation and compared to working in an open source community? It seems that like there isn't a lot of overlap, but there are differences as well.
So I'm not a tech manager and I haven't been paid to manage before, so I do not have any real expertise in the sorts of decisions that you might need to make in that case. And there are people who are better at managing than I am, and I don't really want to preempt their opinions. But thank you for the question.
Hi. So what can you advise to a project which has some contributors, occasional, but the users are mostly silent and you don't really know what exactly what their environment or their problems they're trying to solve. So perhaps some kind of telemetry to get some hard data of how your library is used or something like that.
Find a way to ask people. People are generally well-intended, and if you can track people down and ask them how they are going about things, they will probably offer you answers. But assuming that people are going to come out of the woodwork without giving them an opportunity to or inviting them to is not a great idea. People stay silent if you don't actually go out and seek them out. Got one here. Yeah.
Just sort of following on from what people have asked about, these are issues that are pretty common around managing humans in general and organisational change. Have there been specific resources that you've found useful in learning about how to do this that you would encourage people to go and look at?
I'll need to get back to you. I do, but they're sitting in the back of my head and I haven't been thinking about them that much.
Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
What was the most surprising thing in this journey? Like, where did you go, wait, what just happened?
I was expecting to have a much more difficult path to convincing the LCA team that we should try something completely new. That's because with PyCon there had been a great deal of resistance into moving off of what we were familiar with. There is a bit more organisational continuity in PyCon than there is in LCA. But it was easy to make the initial decisions, which surprised me. But
So given that you had failed so many times before and then sort of suddenly magically succeeded, did your failure actually greatly inform your process to win?
Documenting the reasons for wanting to make a change was very, very useful. Having detailed reasons for where things were problematic and what problems we were going to face into the future, I think convinced some of the people. I can see Craig nodding, so that's a good sign. Craig is my second in command on the LCA team, so he certainly thinks so. So knowing the reasons why you want to make the change and being able to justify it with some degree of experience was very, very useful. And I think that was not really in place for a couple of years of PyCon.
So, Chris, I do actually have a question.
Yes, Craig.
I may have preempted it. Do you think your success is because you've got an absolutely amazing team for LCA next year?
My second in charge is a terrible human being, but otherwise... anyone else?
Thank you for doing this, Chris. It's important work.
Oh,
There is one more question.
great.
In a lot of these sort of volunteer situations, you find that you get people who are really enthusiastic and, you know, both feed in and ready to contribute, and then they drop off really quickly. Is that sort of a common problem you have to deal with, where it's like, look, I've got all these people and they're really keen, and then suddenly after saying they'll do a lot, yeah, they drop off, and you have to sort of manage, yeah, you know, how many people you're actually going to have working on something as opposed to what they're promising to do.
Yes, that is indeed a problem. I invite you to go back and look at Vicky's talk from the previous session. You can find it on the no. There will be a video. That's the word I need to tell you. There will be a video of Vicky's talk on drive-through contributions, which discusses a lot of the ways you as a project can improve sustainability even when you have very short-term engagements from your contributors. But that talk covers it much better than I could and in much better detail.
Thank you, Chris, for this really great talk.
Ooh.
Returning your favor yesterday, and thank you.
Thank you very much.